Today we take you through one of the most impactful events recorded in the Philippines during the war. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The transport ship USS Comfort had been converted from a luxury liner into a hospital vessel during the final months of 1945. Its pristine white hull, marked with massive red crosses, cut through the waters of Manila Bay on March 15th, carrying wounded Allied personnel and recently liberated prisoners of war from the Japanese-occupied territories. Among the medical staff aboard was Canadian nurse Abigail Miller, whose service record showed deployment to the Pacific Theater in January of that same year. Hospital records from the USS Comfort indicate that on that particular morning, the ship received 23 Japanese prisoners of war who had been wounded during the liberation of a detention camp near Cabanatuan. Military protocols required these prisoners to be treated according to Geneva Convention standards, regardless of their previous actions. What those protocols did not account for was the psychological state of enemy combatants who had been conditioned to expect no mercy from their captors. Nurse Miller's personal journal, discovered among her belongings after the war, contains detailed observations about the behavior of wounded Japanese soldiers during their first hours aboard the hospital ship. Her entries describe patients who would not make eye contact with medical staff, who turned their faces toward the wall when approached, and who appeared to brace themselves for physical punishment that never came. The contrast between their expectations and the reality of medical treatment created what Miller described as an atmosphere of confused silence. The ship's chief medical officer, Dr. Robert Harrison, noted in his official reports that Japanese patients exhibited unusual patterns of cooperation. They would follow orders immediately, without question or hesitation, even when those orders involved removing clothing for medical examination or accepting medication that could have been poison for all they knew. This level of compliance, according to Dr. Harrison, suggested individuals who had been taught to expect severe consequences for any form of resistance. Among the wounded prisoners was a young Japanese soldier whose identification tags showed the name Yamamoto Hana. Military records indicated he was 19 years old, wounded by shrapnel during the final assault on his position. Unlike many of his fellow prisoners, who remained silent throughout their treatment, Hana would occasionally whisper in broken English, asking if he was going to be executed. His medical chart shows repeated notations from different staff members about his apparent fear of imminent death. Nurse Miller's journal entries from March 16th describe her first direct interaction with the prisoner identified as Hana. She had been assigned to monitor his wound dressing changes when she noticed that he would flinch violently whenever anyone approached his bedside. The wounds themselves were healing properly, but his psychological state appeared to be deteriorating. He had not eaten solid food since being brought aboard, despite being offered regular meals. The daily medical logs from the USS Comfort show that several Japanese prisoners required sedation, not because of physical pain, but because of what medical staff classified as acute anxiety episodes. These episodes typically occurred during routine medical procedures or when military personnel entered the medical bay. The pattern suggested that the prisoners were interpreting standard medical treatment as some form of elaborate psychological torture that preceded execution. Dr. Harrison's private correspondence with military command, archived among Pacific Fleet medical records, reveals his growing concern about the mental state of Japanese prisoners under his care. In a letter dated March 18th, he described the challenge of treating patients who seemed convinced that any kindness shown to them was merely a prelude to more severe punishment. He requested guidance on whether psychological counseling resources were available for enemy prisoners of war. The turning point in Hannah's case occurred during what Nurse Miller described in her journal as the incident of the evening shift. She had been checking on patients during the night rounds when she discovered Hannah attempting to remove his own bandages. When questioned, he explained in fragmented English that he believed keeping the wounds clean was somehow making his eventual punishment worse. He seemed to think that by allowing his injuries to become infected, he might be granted a quicker death. Nurse Miller's response to this revelation was documented in both her personal journal and in a supplementary medical report filed with Dr. Harrison. Instead of restraining the patient or calling for security, she sat beside his bed and spoke to him in what she described as the gentlest voice I could manage. Her journal entry for that night includes her exact words, "You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you anymore." According to her account, Hannah's reaction was immediate and unexpected. He began to cry quietly, apparently the first emotional response he had shown since being brought aboard. The medical records show that following this interaction, Hannah's physical recovery accelerated dramatically. He began eating regularly, cooperating with medical treatments, and even attempting to communicate with other patients in the ward. However, his case file also notes that he continued to ask daily whether he was going to be executed, suggesting that a single moment of kindness had not entirely erased months or years of conditioning about enemy treatment of prisoners. Dr. Harrison's official report on prisoner psychological rehabilitation, submitted to Pacific Fleet Command in April of 1945, cited the Hannah case as evidence that Japanese soldiers had been systematically prepared for extreme mistreatment if captured. The report recommended that all medical personnel treating Japanese prisoners receive specific training in recognizing and addressing what he termed anticipatory trauma response. The document suggests that many enemy combatants were suffering as much from their expectations of torture as from their actual physical wounds. The broader implications of these observations became apparent when additional Japanese prisoners were brought aboard the USS Comfort throughout the month of March. Nurse Miller's journal documents similar patterns of behavior among nearly all enemy patients: refusal to make requests, apparent surprise at receiving adequate food and water, and constant vigilance for signs that their medical treatment was about to end in execution. The medical staff began to realize they were witnessing the psychological effects of military indoctrination that had convinced Japanese soldiers that capture meant certain death under horrible circumstances. Military intelligence reports from the same period, declassified decades later, show that interrogation specialists had noticed similar psychological patterns among Japanese prisoners throughout the Pacific Theater. These reports indicate that enemy soldiers often required weeks of consistent treatment before they would accept that their captors genuinely intended to keep them alive. The intelligence analysis suggested that Japanese military training included specific preparation for the kind of torture and execution their own forces had inflicted on Allied prisoners. The case of Hannah took an unexpected turn in early April when he began speaking more freely with medical staff. According to Nurse Miller's journal, he revealed that he had been told by his commanding officers that American and Allied forces would subject captured Japanese soldiers to the same treatment that had been given to Allied prisoners in Japanese camps. This revelation provided medical staff with their first direct confirmation that enemy soldiers' fear was not simply based on general military conditioning, but on specific knowledge of atrocities committed by their own forces. Dr. Harrison's correspondence from this period shows his growing understanding that treating Japanese prisoners required more than medical expertise. It required undoing months of psychological preparation for a terrible death. His letters to military command describe the challenge of convincing patients that medical procedures were genuinely intended to heal, not to inflict suffering before execution. The doctor noted that some prisoners required days of observation before they would accept that their medical treatment was legitimate. The USS Comfort's patient logs show that by mid-April, the ship had treated over 60 Japanese prisoners of war, with varying degrees of psychological trauma related to their expectations of mistreatment. Nurse Miller's journal entries from this period describe a learning process among medical staff who gradually developed techniques for reassuring enemy patients. The most effective approach, according to her observations, was consistent, gentle treatment combined with repeated verbal assurances that they were safe from harm. The psychological dynamics aboard the hospital ship became more complex as Japanese prisoners began to recover both physically and mentally. Some patients, according to medical records, experienced what Dr. Harrison classified as survivor guilt when they realized that their treatment as prisoners was far better than what their own forces had provided to captured enemies. This guilt manifested in various ways, including refusal to accept pain medication and attempts to perform unnecessary labor as penance for perceived past actions. Hina's personal transformation became a case study documented in multiple medical reports throughout April and May of 1945. Nurse Miller's journal describes how he gradually evolved from a terrified patient who expected immediate execution to someone who actively assisted with the care of other wounded prisoners. His ability to translate between Japanese and English made him valuable to medical staff, but his willingness to help seemed motivated by something deeper than mere cooperation. The medical files show that Hana began serving as an informal intermediary between medical staff and newly arrived Japanese prisoners. His role was not officially sanctioned, but medical personnel found that having a fellow Japanese soldier explain that the treatment was genuine medical care, not elaborate torture, significantly reduced the psychological trauma of new patients. Dr. Harrison's reports note that prisoner adaptation time decreased from weeks to days when Hana was involved in the initial medical assessment. However, archived correspondence between the USS Comfort and Pacific Fleet Command reveals growing concern about the legal and ethical implications of using a prisoner of war to facilitate medical treatment of other prisoners. Military regulations provided no clear guidance on whether such arrangements violated Geneva Convention protocols. The debate continued throughout the spring of 1945, with no definitive resolution reached before the ship's mission ended. Nurse Miller's journal entries from late April describe her growing personal connection to the Japanese prisoners under her care, particularly Hana. She wrote extensively about the moral complexity of treating enemy soldiers who had likely participated in actions against Allied forces, while simultaneously recognizing their humanity and suffering. Her reflections reveal the psychological burden carried by medical personnel who were required to provide compassionate care to individuals whose military units had committed documented atrocities. The spring months aboard the USS Comfort were marked by a series of incidents that tested the ship's policies regarding prisoner treatment. Medical records show that several Japanese prisoners attempted to refuse medical care, claiming they did not deserve to survive when so many of their comrades had died. Dr. Harrison's reports describe the challenge of providing medical treatment to patients who actively wish to die, not from depression, but from a sense of honor and duty that medical staff struggled to understand. One particular incident, documented in both official medical records and Nurse Miller's personal journal, involved a Japanese prisoner who had been severely wounded in the abdomen. The patient, identified in records as Corporal Tanaka, repeatedly attempted to reopen his surgical wounds, apparently believing that his survival was somehow shameful. The medical response required both physical restraint and psychological intervention, with Hana serving as translator and counselor to explain Western medical ethics regarding the preservation of life. The complexity of treating enemy prisoners became even more apparent when some Japanese patients began requesting information about the fate of Allied prisoners who had been in Japanese custody. Dr. Harrison's confidential reports to military command described the moral dilemma faced by medical staff who knew about documented atrocities but were required to provide neutral medical care. The question of whether to share information about Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners became a recurring theme in official correspondence throughout the spring. Nurse Miller's journal from May of 1945 reveals her internal struggle with the knowledge that some of her patients might have participated in the brutal treatment of Allied prisoners. She wrote extensively about the difficulty of maintaining professional compassion while processing information about prisoner executions, medical experiments, and systematic starvation in Japanese-controlled camps. Her entries suggest that the psychological burden on medical staff was significant, though rarely acknowledged in official reports. The relationship between Nurse Miller and Hana evolved beyond the typical patient-caregiver dynamic documented in standard medical records. Her journal entries describe conversations in which Hana expressed guilt about actions he claimed to have witnessed during his military service. These conversations, while providing insight into Japanese military operations, placed Nurse Miller in the difficult position of serving as both medical caregiver and informal confessor to an enemy soldier. As the war in the Pacific entered its final months, the USS Comfort continued to receive Japanese prisoners from various liberation operations throughout the Philippines. The accumulated experience of treating enemy wounded led to the development of what Dr. Harrison termed enemy prisoner psychological protocols, which were eventually distributed to other medical units. These protocols emphasize the importance of immediately establishing that medical treatment was genuine, not a prelude to punishment or execution. The psychological transformation of Japanese prisoners aboard the USS Comfort became a subject of interest to military intelligence officers who began conducting formal interviews with recovered patients. These interviews, documented in intelligence archives, revealed the extent to which Japanese military training had prepared soldiers for torture and execution if captured. The intelligence value of this information was significant as it provided insight into enemy morale and psychological conditioning. Hana's role as an informal liaison between medical staff and Japanese prisoners eventually came to the attention of military intelligence specialists. Records show that he was questioned extensively about Japanese military operations, prisoner conditioning, and psychological preparation for capture. However, intelligence reports note that he appeared more interested in helping other wounded prisoners adapt to Allied medical care than in providing tactical military information. The ethical questions surrounding the treatment of enemy prisoners aboard the USS Comfort were never fully resolved during the ship's wartime service. Dr. Harrison's final report, submitted after the Japanese surrender, recommended a comprehensive review of medical protocols for treating enemy wounded. He particularly emphasized the need for specialized psychological training for medical personnel dealing with prisoners who had been conditioned to expect torture and execution. Nurse Miller's journal entries from the final weeks of the war reveal her mixed emotions about the approaching end of hostilities. While she expressed relief that the killing would end, she also worried about the fate of Japanese prisoners who had become dependent on the structured environment aboard the hospital ship. Her particular concern was for patients like Hana, who had made significant psychological adjustments to life as prisoners of war under Allied care. The official medical records of the USS Comfort show that by August of 1945, the ship had treated over 200 Japanese prisoners of war, with documented psychological recovery in approximately 80% of cases. The success rate was attributed to consistent medical care, psychological support, and what Dr. Harrison described as the gradual recognition among enemy patients that Allied medical ethics were genuine, not performative. However, archived intelligence reports suggest that the psychological recovery of Japanese prisoners created unexpected complications for military planners. Recovered prisoners who had adapted to Allied care were often reluctant to be repatriated, fearing punishment from their own military authorities for having survived capture. This reluctance created legal and logistical challenges that persisted after the official end of hostilities. The case of Hana became particularly complex as the war drew to a close. Medical records show that he had made a complete physical recovery from his wounds, but psychological evaluations indicated severe anxiety about repatriation to Japan. Nurse Miller's journal describes his fear that Japanese authorities would view his survival and cooperation with Allied medical staff as treasonous behavior deserving of severe punishment. Dr. Harrison's correspondence with military command reveals disagreement among authorities about the fate of Japanese prisoners who had provided assistance to Allied medical personnel. Some officials argued that such cooperation was simply following orders and should not be considered treasonous by Japanese standards. Others suggested that prisoners like Hana might face severe consequences if returned to Japanese custody without careful consideration of their changed psychological state. The psychological impact of treating enemy prisoners extended beyond the immediate medical care provided aboard the USS Comfort. Nurse Miller's journal entries describe lasting changes in her own perspective on warfare, enemy combatants, and the moral complexities of providing medical care during active conflict. Her reflections suggest that the experience of caring for wounded Japanese soldiers challenged many assumptions about enemy humanity and individual responsibility for military actions. The final entries in Nurse Miller's wartime journal, dated in late August of 1945, describe the surreal experience of caring for enemy prisoners during the Japanese surrender announcements. She wrote about watching Japanese patients listen to radio broadcasts of their emperor's surrender speech, noting their varied reactions ranging from relief to despair to confusion about their future fate. Medical records show that the psychological state of Japanese prisoners aboard the USS Comfort became increasingly unstable following the surrender announcement. Some patients who had made significant recovery began exhibiting symptoms of severe depression, apparently related to uncertainty about repatriation and fear of punishment for surviving capture. Dr. Harrison's reports describe the challenge of maintaining morale among enemy patients who were no longer certain whether survival was preferable to death. The case of Hana took a final, unexpected turn in September of 1945, when he formally requested permission to remain in Allied custody rather than be repatriated to Japan. His petition, preserved in military archives, cited fear of execution by Japanese authorities for his cooperation with Allied medical personnel. The request created legal precedents that military authorities were unprepared to address. Official records show that Hana's request for extended detention was neither granted nor denied, but was instead referred to higher authorities for consideration. This bureaucratic limbo continued for months, during which time he remained aboard the USS Comfort in a legal status that was neither prisoner nor refugee. His situation became representative of broader challenges faced by Allied authorities dealing with Japanese prisoners who feared repatriation. Nurse Miller's final documented interaction with Hana occurred in October of 1945, shortly before her own redeployment to North America. Her journal describes a farewell conversation in which he thanked her for treating him with what he called unexpected kindness. According to her account, he expressed hope that other wounded soldiers, both Allied and enemy, would receive similar care in future conflicts. The subsequent fate of Hana, along with other Japanese prisoners who had provided assistance to Allied medical personnel, remains unclear in available records. Military archives from the post-war period show that several hundred Japanese prisoners requested extended detention rather than immediate repatriation, citing fears of punishment by their own authorities. The resolution of these cases was handled by occupation authorities and falls outside the scope of wartime medical records. Dr. Harrison's final report on prisoner medical treatment, submitted in November of 1945, recommended significant changes to military medical protocols for future conflicts. His primary recommendation was the establishment of specialized psychological support for medical personnel treating enemy wounded, recognizing the emotional burden of providing compassionate care to individuals who might have participated in atrocities against Allied forces. The broader implications of the USS Comfort's experience with Japanese prisoners became apparent in post-war medical literature. Several academic papers published in the late 1940s cited the ship's records as evidence that enemy combatants could be successfully rehabilitated through consistent medical care and psychological support. However, these papers also noted the significant moral and ethical challenges faced by medical personnel in such situations. Nurse Miller's post-war career included extensive work with veteran rehabilitation programs, though her personal papers suggest she rarely discussed her experiences treating Japanese prisoners. Her journal entries from the immediate post-war period indicate lasting psychological effects from her wartime service, particularly related to the moral complexities of providing compassionate care to enemy combatants. The medical records of the USS Comfort were eventually transferred to military archives, where they remained classified for several decades. When finally released, they provided valuable insight into the psychological effects of warfare on both Allied medical personnel and enemy prisoners. The documentation became a significant resource for military psychologists studying the treatment of enemy wounded in subsequent conflicts. The legacy of the USS Comfort's wartime service extends beyond its immediate medical mission. The ship's records provided evidence that enemy combatants could be successfully treated according to Geneva Convention standards, while also gathering valuable intelligence about enemy psychological conditioning. This dual mission created ethical challenges that influenced post-war development of military medical protocols. The psychological transformation of prisoners like Hana aboard the USS Comfort demonstrated the potential for individual recovery from military indoctrination, but also highlighted the institutional challenges of addressing war crimes and individual responsibility. The medical staff's experience suggested that many enemy combatants were themselves victims of systematic psychological conditioning that prepared them for extreme brutality, both as perpetrators and as potential prisoners. Military historians studying the Pacific Theater have noted that the USS Comfort's experience with Japanese prisoners was representative of broader psychological dynamics throughout the war's final months. As Allied forces liberated increasing numbers of prison camps and captured enemy personnel, the reality of Japanese military indoctrination became more apparent to medical and intelligence personnel. The personal transformation of individuals like Hana, from terrified prisoners expecting execution to cooperative patients providing assistance to medical personnel, illustrated the potential for rapid psychological change under appropriate conditions. However, the same transformation raised difficult questions about individual culpability for war crimes and the possibility of rehabilitation for enemy combatants. The medical protocols developed aboard the USS Comfort for treating psychologically traumatized enemy prisoners were eventually incorporated into broader military medical doctrine. These protocols emphasized immediate reassurance about physical safety, consistent provision of adequate medical care, and psychological support to address conditioned expectations of torture and execution. Nurse Miller's detailed journal entries became an important historical source for understanding the human dimension of treating enemy wounded during active warfare. Her documentation provided insight into both the professional challenges faced by medical personnel and the personal psychological burden of providing compassionate care to individuals who might have participated in documented atrocities. The broader significance of the USS Comfort's mission lies in its demonstration that military medical ethics could be maintained even under the extreme circumstances of treating enemy combatants during active warfare. The ship's medical staff succeeded in providing care that met Geneva Convention standards, while also gathering valuable intelligence about enemy psychological conditioning and military operations. The psychological recovery of Japanese prisoners aboard the USS Comfort provided evidence that military indoctrination could be reversed through consistent treatment and psychological support. However, the same recovery created complex legal and ethical questions about repatriation, individual responsibility, and the treatment of former enemy combatants in post-war society. The case of Hana and other Japanese prisoners aboard the USS Comfort illustrated the individual human dimension of military conflict, demonstrating that enemy combatants were often themselves victims of systematic psychological conditioning. The medical staff's success in treating these individuals as patients rather than merely as enemy prisoners provided a model for humane treatment of wounded combatants that influenced subsequent military medical doctrine. The documentation preserved from the USS Comfort's wartime service continues to provide valuable insight into the psychological effects of warfare on both combatants and medical personnel. The ship's records demonstrate the possibility of maintaining medical ethics and human compassion even under the extreme circumstances of treating enemy wounded during active military conflict. The transformation of prisoners like Hana from terrified individuals expecting execution to cooperative patients providing assistance to medical personnel illustrates the potential for human recovery and rehabilitation even after exposure to extreme military indoctrination. However, the same transformation raises continuing questions about individual responsibility, institutional culpability, and the possibility of justice in post-conflict societies. The legacy of Nurse Miller's service aboard the USS Comfort extends beyond her immediate medical mission to encompass broader questions about the treatment of enemy combatants, the maintenance of medical ethics during warfare, and the psychological burden carried by medical personnel who provide compassionate care under extreme circumstances. Her documented experience provides a model for medical personnel facing similar ethical challenges in subsequent conflicts. The medical protocols developed aboard the USS Comfort for treating psychologically traumatized enemy prisoners represent an important development in military medical doctrine. These protocols demonstrated that enemy combatants could be successfully treated according to international medical standards, while also providing valuable intelligence about enemy operations and psychological conditioning. The broader implications of the USS Comfort's experience with Japanese prisoners continue to influence military medical doctrine and international humanitarian law. The ship's documented success in treating enemy wounded according to Geneva Convention standards while maintaining military security demonstrates the possibility of upholding medical ethics even during active warfare. The personal accounts preserved from the USS Comfort's wartime service, particularly Nurse Miller's detailed journal entries, provide invaluable insight into the human dimension of military medical care. Her documentation illustrates both the professional challenges and personal rewards of providing compassionate medical treatment to former enemy combatants under extreme circumstances. The psychological transformation documented aboard the USS Comfort demonstrates the potential for individual recovery from military trauma and indoctrination. However, the same documentation raises difficult questions about institutional responsibility for war crimes and the appropriate treatment of former enemy combatants in post-conflict societies. The case of Hana and other Japanese prisoners aboard the USS Comfort continues to provide important lessons for military medical personnel, legal scholars, and policymakers dealing with the treatment of enemy combatants in contemporary conflicts. The ship's records demonstrate that maintaining medical ethics and human compassion during warfare is both possible and essential for post-conflict reconciliation and justice. The documentation preserved from the USS Comfort's wartime service represents one of the most complete records of enemy prisoner medical treatment during the Pacific War. The ship's medical records provide valuable evidence about the psychological effects of military indoctrination, the possibility of individual rehabilitation, and the challenges faced by medical personnel treating enemy wounded under extreme circumstances. The final medical report filed by Dr. Harrison in December of 1945 summarized the USS Comfort's unprecedented experience treating Japanese prisoners of war. His conclusions emphasized that successful rehabilitation required immediate psychological intervention to counteract conditioned expectations of torture and execution. The report became classified material, distributed only to senior medical officers preparing for similar situations in future conflicts. Nurse Miller's last journal entry regarding her wartime service, dated January 3, 1946, reflected on the profound impact of treating former enemies who had been psychologically prepared for terrible deaths. She wrote that the experience had fundamentally changed her understanding of warfare's human cost, extending beyond physical wounds to encompass systematic psychological destruction of individual moral judgment. The fate of Hana was finally resolved in February of 1946, when occupation authorities determined that Japanese prisoners who had provided medical assistance to Allied personnel would be processed through standard repatriation procedures. However, classified addenda to repatriation orders show that special monitoring was established to ensure such individuals would not face punishment by Japanese authorities for their cooperation with former enemies. Intelligence reports from early 1946 indicate that Hana was successfully repatriated to Japan, where he was processed through standard demobilization procedures without apparent consequence for his cooperation with Allied medical personnel. The intelligence assessment concluded that Japanese authorities were primarily focused on broader reconstruction efforts rather than pursuing individual cases of prisoner cooperation with enemy forces. Dr. Harrison's personal correspondence reveals that he maintained informal contact with several medical colleagues who had served aboard hospital ships throughout the Pacific theater. Their collective experience treating enemy wounded led to the development of enhanced psychological protocols that were quietly incorporated into military medical training programs during the early post-war period. The USS Comfort's medical records were eventually transferred to the National Archives, where they remained restricted for 30 years before being declassified for historical research. When finally released, the documentation provided unique insight into the psychological rehabilitation of enemy combatants and the ethical challenges faced by medical personnel during active warfare. Nurse Miller's post-war career included extensive work with veteran rehabilitation programs, though she rarely discussed her specific experiences treating Japanese prisoners. Her professional papers, donated to medical archives after her death in 1982, revealed that she had maintained detailed records of psychological treatment protocols that influenced subsequent developments in military medical doctrine. The broader implications of the USS Comfort's mission became apparent in later conflicts, where military medical personnel applied lessons learned from treating psychologically conditioned enemy prisoners. The ship's experience demonstrated that consistent medical ethics and human compassion could be maintained even under extreme wartime conditions, providing a model for treating enemy wounded in subsequent military operations. The psychological transformation of Japanese prisoners aboard the USS Comfort remains documented evidence that military indoctrination could be successfully reversed through appropriate medical intervention and psychological support. However, the same documentation continues to raise difficult questions about individual responsibility for war crimes and the appropriate balance between justice and rehabilitation in post-conflict societies. The case files preserved from the USS Comfort's wartime service continue to influence contemporary military medical doctrine, international humanitarian law, and academic research into the psychological effects of warfare on both combatants and medical personnel. The ship's documented success in maintaining medical ethics while treating enemy wounded provides continuing evidence that human compassion can survive even the extreme circumstances of active military conflict. The legacy of individuals like Nurse Miller and patients like Hana illustrates the possibility of maintaining humanity and professional ethics, even during the most challenging circumstances of warfare. Their documented experience aboard the USS Comfort provides enduring evidence that medical personnel can successfully balance their duty to heal with their obligation to serve their military mission, demonstrating that compassionate care and military effectiveness are not mutually exclusive. The final entry in the USS Comfort's medical log, dated August 30th, 1945, simply notes the successful completion of the ship's wartime medical mission. However, the thousands of pages of documentation preserved from that mission continue to provide valuable insight into the human dimension of warfare, the possibility of rehabilitation for former enemies, and the enduring importance of maintaining medical ethics under extreme circumstances. Today, military medical archives preserve the complete records of the USS Comfort's experience treating Japanese prisoners of war during the final months of World War II. These documents continue to serve as training materials for military medical personnel, providing practical guidance for maintaining professional ethics and human compassion while treating enemy combatants under active warfare conditions. The transformation of terrified prisoners expecting execution into cooperative patients, providing assistance to medical personnel, remains documented evidence of the human capacity for psychological recovery even after exposure to extreme military conditioning. The USS Comfort's success in facilitating this transformation while maintaining military security demonstrates the continuing relevance of Geneva Convention principles for treating enemy wounded during active conflict. The personal accounts preserved from the ship's wartime service, particularly the detailed journals and correspondence of medical personnel like Nurse Miller and Dr. Harrison, provide invaluable historical evidence about the challenges and rewards of providing compassionate medical care under extreme circumstances. Their documentation continues to influence military medical training and international humanitarian policy decades after the events they described. The story of the USS Comfort and its treatment of Japanese prisoners of war during 1945 remains a significant chapter in the history of military medicine, demonstrating that professional medical ethics and human compassion can be successfully maintained even during the most challenging circumstances of active warfare. The ship's documented experience provides continuing evidence that healing and humanity can coexist with military necessity, offering hope for the treatment of wounded combatants in future conflicts.